Before Spartacus became a symbol of rebellion, he was a man, flesh, blood and fire. He wasn't born to chains. Historians believe he was a Thracian, a fierce warrior from a rugged land northeast of Greece. He likely fought for Rome at one point as an auxiliary soldier, but something went wrong. Whether he deserted, disobeyed, or simply refused to kneel, Rome decided to break him. He was captured, sold, and stripped of identity. To Rome, he was no longer a man. He was property. A slave, and worse, a gladiator. Imagine this. One morning you wake up a soldier fighting for your people. That night you're shackled, branded, and caged like an animal. You're forced to entertain the very empire that crushed your life, all for the bloodthirsty cheers of strangers. At the gladiator school in Capua, Spartacus trained to kill for sport. Every fight was survival. Every glance could be your last. But something inside him never gave in. He watched, listened, waited. And when the moment came, he didn't just try to escape. He tried to change the world. Spartacus wasn't just fighting for his freedom. He was fighting for the thousands who suffered silently under Rome's iron fist. He believed, perhaps naively, that people could rise together, that they could not only run from chains but break them entirely. But in a world ruled by legions, how far could one man really go? This is where the story begins, not just of a man but of a movement, a desperate cry for dignity that shook the mightiest empire the world had ever known. Capua, 73 BCE. In the bowels of the gladiator school, behind locked gates and beneath the jeering of spectators above, something began to simmer. Not just hatred, hope. Spartacus and around 70 fellow slaves, many of them trained killers like him, shared more than wounds. They shared a secret. They had no swords, no armour, no cavalry. But they had something Rome couldn't understand. Nothing to lose. Plan wasn't grand. It was survival. They seized kitchen knives, cleavers, anything that could pierce flesh. When the guards came, they were met not by obedience, but by rage. Blood ran where food once cooked. They stormed into the open air of Capua, not as fugitives, but as a new kind of army. As they fled, they stumbled upon a wagon of gladiatorial weapons headed for another arena. Fate, or the gods, or blind luck, whatever you believe, handed them steel. Real swords, real shields. And with them, a real chance. From that moment, this wasn't an escape, it was an uprising. They headed south to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius, using its high ground as a fortress. Rome laughed at first. Just a band of escaped slaves, they said. They'll starve or kill each other. But Spartacus wasn't waiting to die. He trained them, strategized. He turned broken men into soldiers, grief into discipline. Soon more slaves began to hear whispers. Spartacus is free. He's building an army. He fights back. They came in droves. Men, women, children, farmhands, shepherds, labourers. Not warriors, not yet. But they carried one thing stronger than iron: desperation. And then came the first Roman force. Ill-prepared, arrogant, and entirely unready for what faced them. Spartacus ambushed them, crushed them. Rome tasted humiliation, and something far worse: fear. Because the cellar was on fire now, and the flame was spreading. High atop the volcanic ridges of Mount Vesuvius, where clouds kissed jagged rock and ash swirled in the wind like ghosts of the forgotten, a new society began to form. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was free. And in the centre of it stood a man with chains on his soul, but fire in his eyes. Spartacus. From every direction slaves were running, not just to escape their masters, but to follow him. Blacksmiths, herders, carpenters, cooks, even mothers carrying babies strapped to their backs. Some of them never held a weapon, but now they were part of something bigger. The camp grew into a makeshift village. There was laughter again, music at night, and the warmth of shared bread. For many, it was the first taste of dignity they had ever known. And yet above the joy loomed a constant shadow: Rome. To the Senate, this wasn't just a revolt, it was an insult, an embarrassment, a stain on the fabric of their control. The idea that their prized gladiators, once forced to kill for sport, had now turned their blades on Rome itself. Unthinkable. So they sent an army. Not a large one. They still didn't take Spartacus seriously. Just a couple of thousand Roman militia, expecting a swift slaughter. But Spartacus was no longer a cornered slave. He was becoming a commander. Every scar on his body became a lesson. Every tear shed by his people became fuel. The Romans marched up the only visible path to the summit, confident, cocky. But Spartacus had something they didn't expect: imagination. With ropes made from twisted vines and ladders crafted from stolen wood, Spartacus and his men descended the mountain from the opposite side of the cliff, a sheer face no one thought passable. Under cover of night, like shadows born from ash, they flanked the Romans, encircled them, and unleashed fury. It wasn't a battle, it was a message. Rome had made monsters, and now those monsters had learned to hunt. The enemy was annihilated, supplies were taken, morale unbreakable. The victory sent a chill through the Republic. Rome realized too late, this wasn't just a skirmish, this was a war. And Spartacus, he wasn't a slave anymore. He was a legend in the making, but Spartacus wasn't blind. He knew what lay ahead. Rome was vast, disciplined, and above all, merciless. His people were free for now. But how long could they stay that way? So, around fires burning bright against the dark mountain winds, he spoke to them, not as a conqueror, but as a man. We can run, we can hide, or we can do what Rome never expects: fight like we were born to be free. In those embers, a new fire was lit, not just in their hearts, but across Italy. A storm was coming, and at its centre, Spartacus. The wind shifted. What had once been dismissed as a ragtag uprising was now a roaring inferno, impossible to ignore. Town by town, village by village, the name Spartacus passed from mouth to mouth like a whispered promise, not just of survival, but of vengeance, of justice, of freedom. Rome, the eternal city built on conquest and cruelty, was rattled to its marble bones. This was no longer a revolt of a few dozen slaves. It had become a movement of tens of thousands. Men, women, even children who had known nothing but servitude, now marched under a single banner. Not of empire, not of gods, but of human will. Spartacus and his generals, Crixus, Gannicus, Castus, Oenomaus, led a people's army, not trained, not armoured, but hungry in ways the Romans could never comprehend. Hungry for more than bread, hungry to rewrite their fate. And Spartacus, he had changed. He no longer simply fought to escape. Now he led with vision. He knew how the machine of Rome operated, and how to jam its gears. He didn't strike at fortresses, he struck at roads, at supply lines, at symbols of Roman authority. And he kept winning. Each victory brought more defectors, escaped slaves, oppressed farmers, even some Roman soldiers who could no longer bear the blood on their hands. Camp followers swelled their ranks. Blacksmiths forged weapons from farm tools. Women became spies and scouts. Children gathered herbs to treat wounds. This was no longer just a revolt. It was a parallel society, carved into the Roman landscape. Rome responded the only way it knew how: with force. They dispatched commander after commander, senator after senator, expecting to crush Spartacus like a pest. But he outmaneuvered them, outsmarted them, outsuffered them. He used the terrain like a poet uses metaphor. Every valley, every forest, every storm became a weapon. And with each Roman defeat, panic spread through the Senate. In their arrogance, they had forgotten something simple, something human. A man with nothing to lose. Fights like no one you've ever seen. Still, Spartacus knew freedom couldn't last forever in exile. He had to choose: flee over the Alps, scattering his people, and ending the dream, or stay and strike at Rome itself. Whispers spread through the camp. Will he lead us to Rome? Will we burn the empire to the ground? But Spartacus, he remained quiet, watching the horizon, listening to the cries of the people he now loved like family. He knew this much: the road ahead would be soaked in blood. But if they could reach the gates of Rome, even just once, history would never forget them. The ground was soaked, not with rain, but with the sweat, blood, and hopes of men who had carried a revolution on their backs. Spartacus stood on a hilltop, his eyes scanning the horizon. The green of the Italian countryside seemed almost cruel, too beautiful for the horror that was about to unfold. Before him, the full force of Rome's wrath was gathering. Led by the ambitious and ruthless general Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man determined to make a name by crushing the rebellion that had humiliated the empire. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers stood in formation, well armed, well-fed, and backed by the full resources of a civilization built on conquest. Spartacus, in contrast, led men whose feet were blistered, whose weapons were rusted, and whose dreams were beginning to waver. But they still believed. In him, in freedom, in the impossible. That morning he gave no grand speech, no promises. Only a whisper passed from soldier to soldier. If we die today, we die free. They fought not as soldiers, but as legends in the making. The battlefield was chaos, mud and steel, screams and fire. Spartacus carved a path toward Crassus himself, his sword an extension of his soul. It is said he cut down dozens, desperate to reach the man who symbolized everything they had risen against. But fate is a cruel scribe. Spartacus was wounded, dragged back by comrades, still slashing, still screaming. He would not fall quietly. He would not be erased. But slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. Crixus fell, then Gannicus, then thousands more. The line broke, the Roman noose tightened. One by one, the fires of rebellion were extinguished. And then, silence. Spartacus's body was never found. Some say he died on that field, a sword in his hand, defiant until the last breath. Others whisper he escaped, vanishing into the mountains, a symbol more powerful than flesh. Rome, shaken but victorious, made a display of its cruelty. 6,000 survivors of the revolt were crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road like a grim reminder. For miles and miles, travellers would hear the groans, smell the decay, and remember what it meant to challenge the empire. But something had changed. The slaves who survived would never forget what Spartacus showed them, that Rome could bleed, that even the lowest among them could rise, that freedom was not just a word, it was a flame, and once lit, it could never truly be extinguished. The battlefield was quiet now. Only the crows bore witness to what had taken place. Crassus marched home in triumph, but the road he travelled was lined with the crucified dreams of thousands. A grotesque victory, wrapped in the illusion of order. But the story of Spartacus didn't end with his death. His rebellion was crushed, yes. His army annihilated. His body never recovered. Yet somehow Spartacus became larger than life, a ghost that haunted the very empire that tried to erase him. In taverns and slave quarters, whispers of his name refused to die. He was one of us, they said. He dared to fight. Rome feared that whisper more than any sword. In the years that followed, Rome would go on to face more revolts, more civil unrest. The Senate celebrated Crassus, but his victory felt empty. His political rival Julius Caesar rose in popularity, partially because of the unease Spartacus had left behind. A fear that power could be challenged from below. But Spartacus's legacy was not meant for emperors. It was meant for the forgotten, the voiceless, the oppressed. Centuries later, revolutionaries across the world would invoke his name. In 18th century France, peasants rose against the monarchy and whispered of Spartacus. In Haiti, enslaved Africans led by Toussaint Louverture overthrew their masters and remembered the Roman gladiator who fought for freedom. Even in modern times, films, books and protests carry his image, a chained man who broke the chains of others. Why? Because Spartacus represents something raw and unfiltered, the refusal to accept the world as it is. He was not a perfect man. He had to make brutal choices. He watched friends die, he knew the cost, but he kept going. Not for glory, not for power, but for something deeper. Something that touches every human being at their core. Dignity. Today we remember him not just as a gladiator or a rebel, but as a symbol that even the most powerful empire can be shaken by a single man who dares to say no more. And that is why the name Spartacus still matters. Not because of how he died, but because of how he lived.